The will was written 300 years in the future and dated today. When she read it aloud, he stepped out of her reflection. Death is supposed to be an end point, the final closure of a ledger that has been accumulating for a lifetime, debts settled or abandoned, assets distributed, the continuous forward motion of a person's existence, arriving at its last entry and stopping. This is what estates are for. This is what probate law exists to process. The sorcerer, whose will arrived on Margot Chen's desk on a Thursday morning, had a different understanding of endpoints. He had spent most of his working life, which was, by the will's internal accounting, considerably longer than any life has a right to be, finding the architectural weakness in the concept of a final stopping point and exploiting it with the patient thoroughness of a man who has very little else to do. He had not died. He had deferred. He had outsourced his mortality to a series of future heirs who had, in accepting the inheritance, accepted also what came with it, the specific, transferable weight of a lifespan that was not their own and which its original owner intended, eventually to reclaim. Margot was a probate lawyer. She had seen unusual wills before. She had not seen a will written in blood, dated 300 years in the future, with her own name at the bottom. She read it aloud because that was how she assessed documents. Margot Chen had been a probate lawyer for 11 years, which had given her a thorough and occasionally darkly comic familiarity with the ways in which people chose to manage their assets, their families, and their anxieties from beyond the grave. She had seen wills that left everything to a cat, wills that contained instructions of extraordinary specificity about the display of particular objects, wills that had been written in the apparent grip of a vendetta and had required 3 years of litigation to resolve. She was not easily surprised by the contents of envelopes that arrived at her office. The envelope arrived on a Thursday in November. No sender address. Standard manila, her name and office address in a handwriting she found when she examined it. Unusual in its consistency, not the slight variation of a human hand under normal production conditions, but the mechanical consistency of someone who had spent a very long time writing in one style and had arrived at a perfect reproduction of their own hand. The postmark was illegible. Inside, a single document, folded once. The paper was old, not antique old, not brittling at the edges, but dense and slightly cream in a way that modern papers were not, with a weight and texture she associated with papers produced before the mid-20th century. The ink was not ink. She identified this in the first 30 seconds. The color was too dark, too specific a red, and the consistency of the line too variable in a way she recognized from a case 5 years prior involving a disputed provenance claim as the consistency of a medium that had not been manufactured for commercial use. It was written in blood. The document was a will. Standard structure familiar to her immediately. Last will and testament of name, then the standard preamble of sound mind and dispositive intent, then the estate description, then the bequest. The name in the header was in the same blood ink, but in a script she could not read, not an alphabet she recognized, not any character system she could immediately place. She photographed it for reference and moved on to what she could read. The date was November 14th, 2034. The bequest left the entire estate, described as an empty estate, the contents having been distributed across the preceding centuries, to Margot Chen of her office address, sole heir by right of the debt owed by the living to the deferred, which debt I now call forward. She sat with this for a moment, then she read it aloud. This was her standard practice for all documents of ambiguous structure. Spoken assessment helped her identify the logic. She was on the third line before the first object moved. A pen on her desk, a specific fountain pen she had used for 15 years, capped, lying in its usual position in the upper right corner of the desk's surface, slid approximately 6 centimeters to the left and stopped. She watched this occur without the specific quality of alarm she would normally associate with the observation of an object moving without apparent cause, because the movement was so small and so deliberate and so precisely 6 centimeters that she processed it initially as a vibration artifact from a passing vehicle. She continued reading. The pen moved again, back to its original position, exactly. She looked at it. She looked at the document. She read the next line. The pen's ink, when she picked it up to examine it, was oxidized. Not dry. Oxidized in the way of metal exposed to extended air contact. The pen was 11 months old. The ink had the quality of a pen that had been sitting uncapped for several years. She set it down and looked at the will. The will's date had changed. It still read November 14th, but the year was 2330 rather than 2341. She had not misread 2341. She had photographed the document, and the photograph showed 2341 unambiguously. The document now showed 2330. She read the will aloud 3 more times over the following hour, stopping between each reading to document the changes. By the third reading, the year had advanced to 2314. By the fourth, it was 2297. The document was not aging backward toward her. It was aging forward toward her. The date on its surface moving from its stated future origin in the direction of the present, with each recitation, as though the act of speaking it aloud were pulling it through time toward the moment of her reading. She called the number for a colleague who specialized in legal history and unusual instruments, described what she was looking at without mentioning the date change, and was told that blood-written wills had precedent in several historical traditions and were not necessarily invalid depending on jurisdiction and dating. She did not mention the dating issue. She went home with the document in her briefcase. The sorcerer, whose name she could not read in the will's header, had been born in 1681 in a city that had subsequently changed its name 3 times and had spent the first 50 years of his life in the systematic study of the structural mechanics of mortality. He was, by the tradition in which he worked, a serious practitioner, not a charlatan, not a dilettante, but a man who had treated death as a problem to be solved with the rigor that other men of his era had applied to navigation and hydrostatics. By 1731, he had identified the solution. Mortality was not a property of the organism, but a property of the lifespan. And a lifespan was a discrete quantum of temporal existence that could, with the correct instrument, be detached from its original bearer and distributed across multiple future recipients, The will was the instrument. Written in his own blood, the most powerful binding medium available, the one that carried the complete astral signature of its author, the will constituted a necromantic contract, a legal document in the occult sense, where legal meant binding on forces that did not recognize civil law, but recognized the deeper structures that civil law had been built to approximate. Each named heir, in reading the will aloud, accepted the contract. In accepting the contract, they accepted a fraction of his distributed mortality, not his death, but the actuarial weight of his remaining lifespan, parceled across heirs until the document's date reached the present, and the original bearer could collect what had been preserved for him. He was not dead. He had never been dead. He was 343 years old, distributed across a succession of partially mortal heirs who had, in reading the will aloud, unknowingly agreed to carry a piece of him forward in time. Margot was the last heir. The objects in her apartment began changing the same evening. A photograph on her kitchen shelf, her parents at her graduation a decade ago, had faded to the point of near illegibility, the colors washed to gray, the faces barely present. She picked it up and turned it over, and the back was aged. The paper's texture wrong, the stamp on the back oxidized to a date she recognized as current, but with a physical quality of much greater age. A set of keys on her hook had rusted. Not surface rust, structural rust, the kind that takes years of exposure to develop. She read the will aloud again at her kitchen table. The date advanced another decade toward the present. Her bathroom mirror cracked, not from impact, not from temperature change, but with a specific radial pattern of glass that has been subjected to sustained internal pressure, as though the surface were being pushed from behind. She understood, by the end of the first week, what the will was doing. She had researched the script she had photographed, had found, through a series of increasingly specific academic contacts, a Slavic occult scholar in Prague who identified it as a variant of a 17th century Bohemian binding notation, and who had, when she sent him the photograph, gone quiet for 2 days before responding with a message that read, "Do not read this aloud again. The name in the header is a practitioner I recognize from correspondence in the Schleisheim collection. He is believed to have achieved temporal distribution in 1731. If you have read this document, you should know that the distribution requires a final heir, someone in whom the full contract concludes. The full conclusion requires the bearer to be present. If the date reaches today, stop reading immediately and contact me." She sent a response. She asked what would happen if the date reached today and she didn't stop reading. The Prague scholar replied, "He will be present already." She had been reading the will intermittently for 9 days. The date on the document, when she looked at it on the morning of the 10th day, read, November 14th, 2024. Today's date. She read it one more time, not because she had miscalculated, not because she had forgotten the Prague scholar's instruction, not because the research impulse overrode her judgment in the way that research impulses sometimes did. She read it because the will's final clause, which she had been reading without fully registering since the first evening, specified that the heir's full acceptance required one final recitation, and that the alternative to full acceptance was the distribution's collapse. which would result in all 343 years of deferred mortality being returned to its original bearer simultaneously in the form of death, at the cost of the heir who had failed to conclude the contract. She was the last heir. If she didn't conclude it, he died. If he died, the full weight of his deferred mortality, 3 centuries of it, transferred to her. She read the will aloud. The mirror cracked completely. The cracks sealed themselves. The bathroom became very still. Her reflection was present, correct in every detail. She raised her right hand. The reflection raised its right hand. She turned her head. The reflection turned its head. Then the reflection stepped forward. Not through the glass, not the dramatic breaking of a surface. The specific, unhurried movement of a person stepping through a door that has been open long enough to have become ordinary. The glass remained intact. He simply came through it and stood in her bathroom in the specific physical presence of a man who has been waiting for 300 years and has arrived, finally, at the appointment he made with himself. He was... She observed this with the clinical precision of a person processing something they cannot accommodate through any standard framework. Young, not ageless, not unnaturally preserved. Young, the specific unearned youth of someone in their early 30s, with the quality of health that belongs to someone who has been allocating the cost of their existence to other people for 3 centuries. He looked at her with the warm, specific recognition of a man who has read her name in his own will for decades and is finally in the same room with her. He thanked her. He was, she noted, genuinely gracious about it. He extended his hand. She looked at his hand. She looked at her reflection in the now intact mirror behind him, which showed her face and her bathroom and, where he stood, an absence. No reflection, no presence, nothing at the position his body occupied in the physical space of the room. He was not in the mirror. He was in her bathroom. He was in her bathroom, and he was young, and he was 343 years old. And what he was extending his hand to collect was the remaining lifespan she had been carrying for him since the moment she had read the will aloud on a Thursday morning 9 days ago. She shook his hand. She had no framework in which not to. She was a probate lawyer. She had seen unusual wills before. She read documents aloud as standard practice, and the will had arrived on her desk, and she had read it, and the pen had moved, and she had read it again. By the time she understood what it was, the date was already advancing, and the objects in her apartment were already aging, and the research impulse, the specific professional compulsion to understand what you are looking at, had already carried her most of the way to the conclusion. The final clause is the one I cannot leave alone. The distributions collapse. The alternative she weighed against the final reading would have returned 3 centuries of deferred mortality to him in the form of death, at the cost of the heir who failed to conclude. She could have chosen to die rather than to deliver him. She chose not to. I want to be careful about what I say here, because the choice between dying and allowing a 300-year-old necromancer to step out of your bathroom mirror is not a choice with an obviously correct answer. She made the choice a person makes who does not want to die, which is a thoroughly reasonable thing not to want to do. What she is now, the Prague scholar would probably tell her, is free. The contract concluded. The distribution is complete. He has his lifespan, and she has what the will's terms specified as the heir's remainder, which is the lifespan she was always going to have, minus the decade or so that the contract's carrying cost will eventually be found to have taken. He stepped out of her reflection and thanked her and shook her hand. And she is still in her bathroom in an apartment where the photographs are still slightly faded and the keys are still slightly rusted. He is very young. He has had 300 years to plan what to do with the time she gave him. Thank you for joining me tonight. My name is Alara, and I am your whisperer. I'll be here, waiting for you next time. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment below. I want to hear your stories. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more. This has been Karma Quietly Whispers. See you soon.